In this video of the Breaking Limbs series here on Death by Bunjie, you are going to find out the ultimate reason why crossbow limbs fail. Welcome back to Death by Bunjie and our series on breaking limbs. In this series of videos, we're trying to figure out why the limbs on Bunjie Jr. here broke after only a few seasons. And we're trying to find out why the limbs on the OB, the original Bunjie here, still going strong after 12 seasons. And I'd kind of like to know how long the limbs on Bunjie the Third are going to last. In our first episode of this Breaking Limbs series, we explored a whole bunch of reasons, 3 in particular, why crossbow limbs fail. You'll remember that I interviewed a bunch of people to help me understand this concept. There were basically 3 categories, in my opinion, 3 categories of reasons why crossbow limbs fail. The first category was manufacturer defects. You'll remember that I interviewed crossbow designer Mark Beck, helped me understand some of the different ways that manufacturer defects can cause limb breakages.
There are things that we cannot control on the manufacturing side. Was there a void in the limb? Well, if there was a void in the limb, then you're going to see a true break, a true failure. And there's no way to x-ray for it. There's no way to predict it. It just happened.
We got a brief overview of some of the manufacturer defects that might have affected Bunjie Jr. from Dave at Wyvern Creations.
When the manufacturers start to make these bows smaller and smaller and smaller, they have to have, it's just a whole different nightmare to make a limb do something at that size and still perform like a nice wide long bow. Excalibur had an issue when they first did all this, that when they came in so narrow, the riser was so tight against the fade out that instead of having the limb flexing like that, it would go and hinge at the point of the fade out. It would break right at that spot. Their fix, after they figured out what was going on, and I talked to them, they brought in the manufacturers of the raw materials for the fiberglass and the resin to try to figure this out. Turns out it was putting pressure right here. And if you look at the new risers, they have a gap. It's rounded. Now, instead of being locked here and hinging there, the whole limb flexes. Eliminated all that pinch. Limb problems have gone pretty much.
Is a manufacturer defect, though, to blame for the problems that we had last year with Bunjie Jr. with that limb breakage? I'm not so sure. Now, the new limbs are different for that crossbow. We got new limbs directly from Excalibur, the manufacturer. Ooh, look at this. Look at these little guys. And we put those in place. They are designed slightly differently, and they don't necessarily line up the same way. They come out at an angle, the way that Dave from Wyvern Creations demonstrated. And I can say that Genevieve, when she was cocking Bunjie Jr. for the first time, her muscle memory told her, hey, these are a little bit different. You cock it a little bit more. It's like half a turn more or something like that. So it isn't exactly the same limb design. But when Bunjie Jr.'s limb broke, it didn't really break the way that Dave described it. It didn't just sort of break off, right? It sort of delaminated. So that tells me this is not a Category 1 breakage. It's not a manufacturing defect necessarily that caused Bunjie Jr.'s problems. The second reason that we discussed in that first video about why crossbow limbs fail is that single cliff event, that single catastrophic event that causes the limb to break, aka user error. This category is stuff like, pulling the trigger and a limb goes out and hits the branch next to the tree stand, or hits the tree stand itself, hits the side of the blind. Dry fires fall in this category, things like that. Does that explain why Bunjie Jr.'s limb broke? Now, come on. Genevieve is a second-generation crossbow hunter. I taught her everything she knows, and she still doesn't know anything. In all seriousness, Genevieve and I did our absolute best to make sure that at all times we were following the manufacturer's recommendations and instructions with regard to all the gear and using it all properly. I'm not aware of any single thing, any single event that Genevieve might have performed or gone through with Bunjie Jr. that would have caused that delamination. She was in the backyard cocking it at the time that this happened. And it also happened over a period of time. We noticed that one of the limbs was giving out a little bit and the brace height was becoming sort of off center, if that makes any sense. It wasn't holding accuracy. And looking back, I don't think it was any single event that caused that limb breakage. Instead, the third category that we're left with really is fatigue. You might remember from our first video that Darren Cummings expressed that the way you take a paper clip and
bend it and bend it and bend it. It's putting little tiny cracks in there until you get to the point where there's so many of those cracks and they start to meet up that it just becomes completely, it completely breaks apart.
The weird thing about fatigue, though, 12 seasons with this crossbow, all that hunting, all that shooting in the backyard, and the original Bunjie here, the limbs are still intact. It's its original set of limbs. I get the question every once in a while, do you think that your limbs have fatigued a little bit over the years, however? And I think the answer is no. And the reason I say that is it still shoots 305 feet per second. Not the fastest crossbow in the world, but with a 350 grain arrow, it's still shooting around the original speed. That tells me the limbs are just like they were on day one. That brings me to the topic of this video, and that is the ultimate reason why crossbow limbs fail. The reason why modern crossbow limbs don't last, have problems, is because crossbows are inefficient weapons. Wow, you weren't expecting that now, were you? You thought I was going to say the arrows are too light. That's what you thought. Arrows are the topic of the next episode in this Breaking Limbs series. The truth is, I wasn't expecting that to be the explanation either. I went into this limb breaking series with totally different understanding of what was going on and why limbs break.
I think the first one of the most important things to remember about physics is that you can't create energy, you can't destroy it. It always just goes from one source and it gets transferred into another. So when you're cocking your crossbow, whether that's a crank, whether you're using the ropes or if you're just manhandling it, but all that energy from your muscles that you're putting into, right, the food you ate turns into the strength for your muscles, and then you pull that string back up, those limbs are storing all that energy. So it's just sitting there coiled up, ready to go. From what I could find, it's somewhere around 100 foot-pounds of kinetic energy is what it's able to deliver, 280-pound draw weight, and it does that over 10 inches of stroke. What's really cool about kinetic energy when you're putting it into the bow, it's literally just how much weight you're pulling multiplied by the distance you pulled it. So on that particular crossbow, it's got a very short stroke, 10 inches, less than a foot. So you're putting 280 pounds over 10 inches, which is about 0.83 feet. So if you multiply 280 pounds by 0.83 feet, you'd come up with 233 foot-pounds. So it's really just that simple to figure out how much energy is in the bow. Now, to get a perfect one, perfect actual number, you'd have to look at the curve of draw distance versus how much you're pulling.
In other words, when we're pulling it back, it may not be 280 pounds the entire way.
But it's going to work out really close to that because these bows they're really good at holding that peak weight the entire stroke.
I think it's safe to say that on a recurve crossbow, that curve gets gradually stronger as you're pulling back, and at its full tension, when it's cocked, you're at the maximum draw weight. Compound crossbows, on the other hand, may vary a little bit. There's a let-off with a lot of those models, so when you're pulling it, it might actually get a little bit easier. Again, there's a curve. This is not 100%, but it does illustrate it well. It does give us a really good idea about how much energy these crossbows are storing.
The energy you're putting into the bow doesn't change.
Now, we haven't been talking about how much energy gets put into that crossbow. I haven't really talked about that here on Death by Bunjie. Haven't really given it a lot of thought. I've never calculated it before I started doing this series.
So now if you figure out how much of that makes it into the arrow.
We know how to calculate that. There are various online calculators. There's even an online calculator now on deathbybungie.com that you can use to calculate the kinetic energy in your arrow setup through your crossbow. It's kind of designed specifically for crossbows. It'll give you some pretty good estimates about how much energy you're putting into your arrow.
So those limbs are holding almost 230 foot-pounds of energy. So now if you figure out how much of that makes it into the arrow, and that was that about 100, that means it's somewhere in the range of 40 to 45% efficient.
On one hand, we're putting almost 100 pounds of kinetic energy into an arrow that's going 355 feet per second. That's awesome. But on the other hand, 40% doesn't seem very efficient, does it? I mean, we're putting 40% of the energy into the arrow, but 60% or so is left over and it's just being wasted.
And then it's got this somewhere around 60% of the energy you put into it. It's got to dissipate that. It has to go somewhere. We can't just destroy it. We can't say we got the 40% we wanted into the bolt and with the rest of it, it's just going to disappear. It's got to go somewhere. So that energy is going to go into a couple different things. Typically, whenever you're wasting energy, it's going to go into either sound or heat.
Probably doing damage to the crossbow. It's working those little nuts and bolts loose, and it's ruining our scopes and maybe even breaking our limbs. But then again, I don't have anything to compare it to. I don't know if 40% is good or bad, really.
The compound bow that I shoot, it's a Hoyt Helix, so I did that same calculation. And it's 70-pound draw weight, and it's a 24-inch stroke. That's a 30-inch draw with a 6-inch brace height. So that works out super clean, which is nice. It's 140 foot-pounds. Now, again, it's probably closer to 120, maybe 100, because of the curve. But that works out when you figure out that that bow shoots in the 90 to 93 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. You're looking at about 66% efficient.
All right, so now we see there's a comparison here. We've got 40% efficiency and 60% efficiency. On one hand, we have a crossbow that shoots 350 feet per second, very fast, but it leaves 60% of its energy that it's storing on the table to go back into the crossbow. On the other hand, we have a compound bow, probably shooting slower than that, but it's leaving only 40% of its energy on the table to go back into the bow. Now we've got something to compare it to.
The crossbow you're shooting shoots way faster and it's got way more power, but I'm pulling 70 pounds, you're pulling 280 pounds.
Right, for a little bit faster speed.
Yeah, for some faster speed.
Not 3 times as fast.
Not what you would expect by the fact that you're pulling that much more weight. And some of it comes down to the fact that with the longer draw length, right? I'm pulling it 2 foot versus 10 inches. I've just got more time, more distance to put that energy into it. The big difference comes down to the efficiency.
Efficient means that it does what we want it to do better. Something that's more efficient does what we want it to do better than something that is not efficient. The whole point of a crossbow is to send an arrow down range. An efficient crossbow is going to put most of its energy or more of its energy into that arrow to send it down range. An inefficient crossbow or an inefficient weapon is going to put less energy into the arrow to send it down range and have more energy left over and wasted. Makes sense.
You have way more weight you're pulling. We'd expect way more energy out of that. 233 versus 140. So you're putting way more energy into the limbs of the crossbow than the regular bow, but it's not delivering that same amount more. And the reason for that is because of how quickly that string snaps forward and that bolt is launched. It's in contact with the string for a very, very short period of time.
If you want to hear that entire interview with Darren Cummings, check out Talking with Bunjie, my podcast. You can check that out on the podcast app of your choosing, or you can check it out on deathbybungie.com. In that podcast, we talk about impulse theory, along with everything else that we're talking about. Impulse theory is part of a future video too, so make sure you stay tuned, subscribe here to Death by Bungie. But we're kind of comparing apples to oranges. On one hand, we got compound bows. On the other hand, this is Death by Bungie. This is a crossbow hunting channel here on YouTube. The compound bows and the traditional archery, that's all for other guys to play around with their channels. What's a good amount for a crossbow to have in terms of efficiency? Is 40 a lot or is 40 not a lot? I don't know. So I ran what other numbers I could come up with what other crossbows we have. Let's take a look at Bunjie the Third. Bunjie 3.0, the Deathstalker 420, the Slick Black Cadillac. We will run the numbers on that crossbow. Now, I'm not a math guy. It's not really my thing, but I did spend a couple of weeks struggling to build an online calculator to help us do this math, and that is also on deathbybungie.com. Go check that out. If you look at that online calculator, it'll do this math for us. It'll even convert the inches of the power stroke to feet so we can calculate the foot-pounds of kinetic energy that the crossbow is generating and storing. Play around with that and you can see how your crossbow performs. With Bunjie 3.0, we got a 150-pound draw weight, only 150 pounds. We put that in there, and we also go with our power stroke. Now, Bunjie the Third is a Scorpid Deathstalker 420. With its specs, its manufacturer advertised specs, it's supposed to shoot around 420 feet per second. It accomplishes that speed not by increasing the draw weight necessarily, it's only a 150-pound draw weight, but has a longer power stroke, 17.25 inches. That gives the string more time to impart that energy on the arrow. Now, with the calculator, we don't really have to worry about it, but basically the 17.25 inches is 1.4375 feet. You take the 17.25 and divide it by 12 if you're following along on paper. It'll multiply out that 150 times 1.4375 for overall kinetic energy stored in the crossbow of over 215 foot-pounds. That's how much energy I'm putting into Bunjie the Third when I cock it. That's less than Bunjie Junior, but it shoots faster. Now it's time to enter the arrow information. Now I'm going to use actual data, not the manufacturer specs, okay? When we got to doing this limb series, Genevieve and I spent an afternoon shooting the crossbows in the basement. Been real cold here in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Oh no! No, get off! No!
We shot each of the crossbows with different weight arrows and recorded all of that data. We shot it through chronographs and came up with some interesting numbers. Bunjie the Third shoots a stock Deathstalker arrow, 417 grains. That's the overall weight. I have a little scale and weighed them too. And we got a speed of 384 feet per second or so with that weight of arrow. Bunjie the Third doesn't shoot the advertised speeds because it's got the little rubber things I added to the limbs. They were in the box, so I stuck them on there. So I've added that. That's going to slow the crossbow down a little bit. Plus, you start putting a lighted nock on an arrow. That battery increases the weight of the arrow. And I like to use heavier broadheads and field points and all that good stuff too. Don't forget, a video on arrows is next week's video in this Breaking Limb series. Now, basically, we find out by using that online calculator that we're putting 148.73 foot-pounds of kinetic energy into that arrow to send it downrange. Pretty cool. Based on those numbers, we find out that Bunjie the Third is around 62% efficient. In other words, it's putting around 62% of its energy into the arrow to send it downrange. So all of a sudden now we're seeing we've got 60% or so of the energy going into the arrow with only 40% left over to go back into the system, back into the crossbow. We're kind of getting closer to the compound bow numbers now, aren't we? Shouldn't be much of a surprise, really. If you think back, one of the comments I get time and time again is how quiet that crossbow is. Now, it's hard to really convey the volume of a crossbow over YouTube. There's all kinds of compressors and in the cameras, and there's compressors on YouTube and all that sort of thing that might affect the overall volume or sound of a crossbow going off. But nonetheless, it's a fact that This crossbow is a lot quieter than Bunjie or Bunjie Junior. It makes sense now, doesn't it? It's quieter because there's less leftover energy to get wasted in terms of sound, in terms of volume. Instead, that energy, more of it at least, is being put into that arrow and sent down range. Does that mean Bunjie the Third's going to last longer? The limbs will last longer than Bunjie Junior's limbs? Perhaps. I mean, there's less energy going back into those limbs to ruin them. So inefficiency is the reason why crossbow limbs fail. Inefficient crossbows, inefficient crossbow designs will have broken limbs, but more efficient crossbows will have limbs that last a lot longer. Is that what I'm saying here? Well, let's look at one more crossbow. What other crossbow can we look at and run some numbers on here on Death by Bunjie? Bunjie. We take that magnificent crossbow with its 175-pound draw weight and its 14.5-inch power stroke, which turns out to be about 1.208 feet, and we find out that it generates a whopping 211 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. But when we fire an arrow, there's only 82.98 foot-pounds of energy going into the arrow. I don't like where this is going. That's not very efficient. Think about that. That means there's that much energy going back into the crossbow every time that I fire Bunjie. And think about this. Every time that I dry fired the original Bunjie, and there's been 5 such instances, and in my defense, Bunjie was made before they had dry fire inhibitors that came standard on crossbows, so it really wasn't part of the technology at the time. But when I did that on each of those 5 occasions, all of that kinetic energy that Bunjie can generate, all of it was going back into the crossbow because there was no arrow there to push some of that energy downrange. Wait a minute, you're telling me that the OB, the original Bunjie, right there, the namesake of this channel, Death by Bunjie, that my older, slower crossbow, it's less efficient, but somehow the limbs have still lasted this long? That's odd, isn't it? But it makes a very good point. Bunjie is a 2010 Excalibur Axiom. In 2010, it was the slowest crossbow that Excalibur made. They had other crossbows shooting 350 plus feet per second. Bunjie was the cheapest crossbow that was available from that company, and that's the one that I bought. It was a pretty tried, true, tested design by the time I got a hold of it. Excalibur had long figured out how to make a 300 or so feet per second crossbow. Back in the day, 2010 or so, those newer crossbows, the 350s, those were having some limb issues. They had a variety of issues, even for the next couple of years, back when I first started following crossbows. The difference is Bunjie is built much further from the edge of what crossbow technology back in 2010 could offer. It wasn't built right up to the edge of what crossbow technology could provide. It was, pretty easy for them to make a crossbow that was going to shoot 300 feet per second or so and last.
As we keep pushing to make these bows faster and faster, that means they keep upping the draw weight while trying to either drop the weight of the bolt or keep it consistent. So the stress you're putting it under is moving it up higher and higher. So, and they're trying not to make the crossbows any heavier, right? So that's what you could do. You could make it stronger, a thicker material, but then you're going to up the weight of the crossbow. And anyone who's held a crossbow knows they're already heavy out in front because of the limb. So the more you add weight to that limb, so they're kind of in this pickle where, they want to make them faster to make their bows stand out. But if you make it any heavier, nobody's going to want it.
And I think that's really what's going on here. Crossbow manufacturers want to provide you with the fastest, lightest, and smallest crossbows that they possibly can. And really, that's what we want from them. We want smaller crossbows. We don't want giant crossbows like the original Bunjie. We also want faster crossbows, and we want lighter crossbows. These are things that make crossbows more attractive. They're features that we like. In doing that, they are really pushing the limits of what crossbow technology here in 2022 can handle. They're really pushing those limits. Now, we can't change our crossbow's design. It is what it is. We have the crossbow that we have. Its specs, its design, it is what it is. But are there things that we can do to make it at least a little bit more efficient, so that there's not quite as much energy left over every time that we pull the trigger, so that there's not quite as much energy going back into the crossbow to do that damage? There are some things that we can do to make crossbows a little more efficient. That's the subject of the remainder of videos for this Breaking Limbs series. Until next time, all hail the original Bunjie and its pristine limbs.